Hi, my name is Ray Kirkus, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about standing armies and the militarization of the police that's happening across this country. I'd like to begin with a story about a veteran of the United States Marines. Jose Guarina, who was a Marine and served 2 tours in Iraq, was sleeping in a Pima County home near Tucson, Arizona, on the morning of May 5th, 2011. Jose had just got done working a 12-hour shift at a local copper mine where he worked, and he was resting. In that home was his wife, Vanessa, and their 4-year-old son. Another son, who was 5, was off in school. In that morning, Vanessa was in the adjacent bedroom, and she was getting her son ready, getting him dressed, turning on some cartoons on the TV, and getting ready to make him some breakfast, when she heard a loud noise in the backyard. Well, she didn't know what that was, so she peered out through the blinds, only to see men with guns mulling around her property. This is interesting, and at this point needs to be brought up, that only a year prior to this, Vanessa's family members, 2 of her family members, were murdered in a home invasion. And even the couple who was murdered, their children were actually shot in that invasion, but luckily they survived. So this in the back of her head, or actually in the forefront of what she's thinking about, she ran and she woke Jose up and obviously told him that there was somebody outside. So Jose told her to go hide in the closet with her 4-year-old son, and he went over to the hallway by the kitchen with an AR-15 that he had in the house, to position himself to defend against the intruders. Right at that moment, the front door broke open, and in a hail of gunfire, 71 shots were fired into the house. 22 of those shots struck Jose, where he fell to the floor in a pool of blood and was left there for the next hour or more to bleed out and die. Now, was this a home invasion? Was this an intrusion by some gangs or some criminals? Well, I don't know what you want to call it, but it wasn't a gang of illegal criminals. It was a SWAT team. It was a SWAT team that went to serve a warrant looking for drugs, marijuana specifically. In the end, no marijuana was found inside that home, nor did Jose's body test positive for any drugs. So, it took me longer to tell you about what happened here than it actually took to happen. All of this happened in about a minute. And at what cost to society? Now, the Guarina case is not unique or unusual in this day and age. Botched SWAT raids are becoming a daily occurrence, as these teams are used for a lot more than just what they were originally intended for. Now, for several years now, I've been doing research on excessive policing. I've been reading a lot of materials, and I've been speaking to groups such as Tea Party groups and going to certain council meetings, and even using up the few moments that you have to speak up in public comment to try to inform our politicians, our leaders, local leaders, about what is happening here. And it's not just the SWAT teams that are a problem, it's this growing militarization of the police. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about our nation as far as their stance on what they thought about standing armies and what they thought about, professional policing being amongst the people. Again, there was no such thing as professional police at the time. I also want to inform you about the original intent of SWAT teams, what they were originally used for and what their purpose was. And of course, the trend and what their usage is today. I also want to explain to you about the costs that are borne by society because of these types of botch raids, but not only the botch raids, but all kinds of excessive policing tactics that are going around the country. And finally, I want to tell you what we as citizens can do about curbing this trend and maybe getting some civility on it. So what are standing armies? Well, standing armies are nothing new. They've been around since the beginning of civilization. They trace back to ancient Sumer, or the Sumerians, who had a very diverse civilization, similar to the one that we have in the United States right now. People of different ethnicities came to Sumer and There they had the creation of different artisans, different crafts, different craftsmen, different professions. There were bureaucrats, there were priests, there were merchants, and of course there was the original professional standing army as far as records can show. And what were they used for? Well, standing armies were used to invade and conquer different lands. Standing armies were used to protect the elite, whether it be monarchs or kings, from assassinations or from being overthrown in a coup. And they were also used for just the opposite. Again, it depends where the loyalty of the army lies. If the loyalty was lying to the king, then the king was good. If the loyalty was to somebody who was against the king, then it was bad news for the king. British monarchs, like I said, kings, held huge standing armies before the First and Second Civil War in Great Britain. And during the mid-1700s, a wealthy subject, it's still a subject, wealthy subject in England by the name of John Trenchard wrote a series of essays called A Collection of Tracts. And in 1751, he discussed standing armies. And he quotes, I quote him, as saying, "This subject regarding standing armies is so self-evident that I am almost ashamed to prove it." He writes, "For if we look through the world, we shall find in no country liberty and an army stand together. So that to know whether a people are free or slaves, it is necessary only to ask whether there is an army kept amongst them." Now, eventually, after the two civil wars in England, the Parliament got a little bit of a handle on standing armies and limited to what the king can raise and maintain during times of peace. Times of war was a different situation. Times of war with the United States is a good point, where the founders were very familiar with what standing armies were all about. Now, under names as ghostwriters, whether it be Farmer or Cato, a lot of different essays were published in New England during colonial times. And even the Federalist Papers used ghostwriters. Publius, for example, was Alexander Hamilton, but he was a ghostwriter because they were worried about these standing armies and their power going after them for criticizing the government. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Madison described the standing army as the greatest mischief that could happen. I'm going to quote him because he says, "The means of defense against foreign danger have always been instruments of tyranny at home. Throughout all of Europe, the armies kept under the pretext of defending have enslaved the people." Now, like I said, Alexander Hamilton wrote the same thing as named Publius under Federalist Paper number 56. He said, "Schemes to subvert the liberties of a great community require time." It's very interesting. "Time to mature them for execution. An army so large as seriously to menace those liberties could only be formed by progressive augmentations, which would suppose not merely a temporary combination between the legislature and executive, but a continued conspiracy for a series of time." So these words clearly establish that freedoms, liberties, are eroded gradually through time. So in essence, all of the founders, Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike, they agreed that standing armies were a threat to liberty. They agreed that they had to curb the power of a standing army. And when they crafted the Constitution, they made sure that Article 1, Section 8, which defines the powers of the federal government and limits the powers of the federal government, Clause 12 was included to maintain only standing armies in times of war and to have them reauthorized every 2 years. It's a far cry of what our Congress is doing today. Now that you have a general idea a little bit about what standing armies are all about and how our founders felt about them, I want to run through a quick history of where policing came from and to tie the two together, and then we'll involve the SWAT teams. Now, organized policing began in England about 900 AD, and it was known as kin policing, where families worked together to make sure that their family members didn't do something outside of their family laws. Again, there was no policing, there was no other policing agency. There was an army held by the king, but local policing was done by localities. Eventually, in England, in 1829, they changed that. But before that, in 1630, in the United States, in Boston, ordinances were written that allowed the establishment of a constable. And that constable had the powers to bring other members in to create a neighborhood watch, so to say. They called it a watch. And it was made up of 6 watchmen and the constable and several volunteers, whether they were doing it by volunteered methods or whether they were obligated to do so because of some other reason. They might have been forced to do so. However, they would roam the city of Boston, walking around at night, making sure they kept the peace, light the street lights, and then if something went wrong, they would chase the offender, or alleged offender, and they would do what they called a hue and cry, because there were no sirens, so they would cry out loud, whether it be stop criminal or whatever, to raise awareness of the other watchmen to try to apprehend the criminal. They would apprehend them and hold them in some way, shape, or form until they could be tried. So early law enforcement, and in rural areas, back in those days, the governor that was appointed by the king would pick somebody, a sheriff, somebody who would basically be a constable or a keeper of the peace in certain rural areas. And that person, that sheriff, would actually be used for executing or serving legal documents and even collecting taxes. But again, it was a local constabulary that maintained the peace. That was a peace officer, not a police officer. In 1829, England changed, as I mentioned before, from a reactive police force, or the reactive to a more proactive police force that would try to deter crime. And that carried over about 1833 to the United States, when Philadelphia became the first city with an organized 24-hour police force. And it's pretty much the same type of policing that we have today, even though we refer to it as law enforcement. A lot of people don't even call them the police anymore. Now, SWAT teams came around about 130 years later. SWAT means Special Weapons and Tactical. And the team, this name was tossed around, but that's the name they finally decided upon. And SWAT teams were created for one reason alone. They were created for situations that were up and above the capabilities of a local police officer, whether it would be a hostage situation or whether it would be a barricaded gunman or maybe numerous gunmen. Okay. And these started about 1964, again in Philadelphia was the inception of it, but they didn't become popular or renowned across the country until they were used in 1969 by the Los Angeles Police Department in a shootout with the Black Panthers. This is when the national media caught on that, and this is when they started reevaluating what the reasons, how they had to operate. Because in that shootout, thousands of rounds were fired between the Black Panthers and between the Los Angeles Police Department. And finally, it came to, after injuries from both sides, amazingly, nobody, I think, was killed in that one. They figured out how to get a better SWAT team together. But this was the original intent of SWAT teams. Now, SWAT teams are equipped and trained far more than in a different way than the police officers are. SWAT teams are equipped and trained like soldiers rather than typical street cops, and rightfully so, for the operations that they have to do are up and beyond the regular call of duty what would be for a police officer. But this is where the criticism starts up, because SWAT teams, if they're engaged in the operations that they were meant to be engaged in, they get very little criticism. But when SWAT teams or regular police officers that look like SWAT officers for crowd control or things like that are engaged in situations such as Ferguson was, then you start getting a lot of criticism over the use of this particular militarism within the police department. Now, to compound these issues about this soldier-esque look or the criticism of police looking more like soldiers is programs like the Federal 1033 program. And this is a surplus inventory program that is designed to assist local law enforcement in the war on drugs and the war on terror. And it was originally designed to do that via Congress. Congress set the rules and made sure that they can get some of this equipment that the military uses via the 1033 program and other programs that exist for that particular reason. And what can they get? I mean, it's amazing, because they can gear up through these programs. Police departments can gear up a regular police officer with literally everything that a soldier would have access to on a battlefield. And this includes bayonets, it includes machine guns, it includes grenade launchers, armored vehicles, and even helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, if a law enforcement agency so chooses to go after something like that. Now, originally, like I said, the rules were set by Congress and applied to usage of this equipment, limiting it only for drug enforcement and counterterrorism, nothing more. If it didn't pertain to those two issues, you couldn't get it. But in 2008, those rules were relaxed, allowing for the law enforcement agencies to gear up for use for anything that might be considered law enforcement purposes. Further, there's little or no oversight of the enforcement of how the equipment is used. For the most part, and with very few exceptions, local law enforcement agencies can get just about anything a soldier would have access to in the battlefield. Now, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 prohibits the military from policing the streets of the country. This was done after the Civil War because they saw what happened when armies were policing the streets. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't prohibit the federal government from assisting law enforcement agencies with material support. All the things I mentioned just a minute ago, the grenade launchers and other things, are available. The downside of the police departments getting this equipment is that there is no training that goes along with this equipment. Soldiers are trained. They go through boot camp, they go through specialty trainings to use this equipment. I mean, a soldier who operates the MRAP, that's what he does. He operates an MRAP. But when local police departments get an MRAP, there's no training. I mean, these vehicles are they're top heavy, they're huge, they're overweight, they break bridges, and if they roll over, they become literally a tomb for the people who are inside them. You can't get out. I mean, they're huge, they're metal, they're monster trucks. So anyway, going back to the SWAT teams. These tactics that are used right now by the SWAT teams make these guys look like black ops. They dress them up to look like soldiers with machine guns, and they parade that. I mean, if you look on Facebook pages that are sponsored by local sheriff's departments, they have a huge photograph with all the true team or SWAT team people holding their fully automatic weapons standing in front of a monster vehicle in the background. And this is under the guise that this is keeping us safe. This is, for all practical purposes, the standing army amongst us, keeping us safe. Well, let's talk about SWAT teams. 1975. In 1975, there were about 500 SWAT units that were stationed across the country. Today, there are thousands. In the 1970s, there were a few hundred SWAT raids a year. Again, only for really, really desperate, dire situations where they found to be necessary. And by the early 1980s, there were some 3,000 raids a year. In 2005, almost a decade ago, there were 50,000 raids a year. In the 1980s, the war on drugs is what escalated the frequency of these raids dramatically. Today, SWAT teams are used for practically everything, including serving very low-level misdemeanor warrants. Now recently, just very recently, in the town of Stettin, Wisconsin, a SWAT team was used to collect a fine. A fine from a 75-year-old man bringing 24 officers in an armored vehicle to the property, not because he was dangerous, but he was known to be argumentative. Now, in addition, the costs of manpower to deploy 24 officers, as it was used in Stettin, to collect the fine is, of course, footed by the local taxpayers. The people of Stettin, Wisconsin, or the county in that area had to pay for this, as we're paying for it anywhere we go. Now, I've covered a brief history of standing armies and the founders' thoughts on standing armies. I've touched on the history of professional policing, and I've touched on SWAT and what they've turned into and what the original intent was. And technically, SWAT teams are not a standing army per se. But the recent showing in Ferguson, Missouri, raises a lot of questions about the use of this trend of militarization, which is assisted and promoted by the federal government. Again, it's a very blurred line. So let's talk about the costs. What are these costs of these SWAT raids? Well, SWAT teams are justified, again, in keeping us safe, as the police are charged with serving and protecting the citizens, where soldiers have a different purpose. Soldiers are charged with defending against enemies of the state. When SWAT teams and militarized officers gear up, in protecting us in the name of safety, and they infringe on the rights of civilians or citizens who exercise their constitutional rights to even redress the government for whatever reasons, the line becomes very blurred. As a matter of fact, it may even be crossed. Now, Ben Franklin stated that that those who are willing to sacrifice liberty for a little temporary safety or security deserve neither. In personal opinion, I tend to agree with him. The Garina case, in the Garina case, the combined municipalities ended up awarding the Vanessa or the Garina family $3.4 million for a wrongful death. They never went to court. This was a settlement outside of court. A lot of other cases go way beyond that. A lot of other cases are settled for anywhere from $500,000 to $10 million for wrongful deaths. And these cases extend not only from SWAT raids, but from just police officers responding, shooting people dead. And then, of course, the police officers, in most cases, are cleared of any wrongdoing. Almost always. And this is a problem, and a lot of people wonder why. Why are they being cleared? And I want to explain this. A lot of the police officers are being cleared because of the training that they go through now. The training has completely changed from the early days, from when I was a kid, and police officers went to an academy. After September 11, 2001, and the terrorist attacks on this country, the Department of Homeland Security was created. Now, about 2005, 2006, under the direction of Michael Chertoff, the DHS was actually started allowing police departments to get free training, a new style of training, and a more aggressive training that was taken from a lot of the Mossad type of training from the Israeli Defense Force. This training was more aggressive, more in your face, more shoot first and ask questions later. More, if there's any possibility of somebody on that SWAT team or somebody being injured or hurt, regardless of how remote that possibility is, then the right thing to do is to take out the target. This is the training that is used to clear the officers, because they no longer think, they act. I'll give you a perfect example of this particular training. Is if the SWAT team breaks on a no-knock raid, they kick in the door and somebody might be holding a knife in their hand, they are told to shoot that individual. You might get lucky and be told to drop the knife. Now, Jose Garina never was told to drop anything. So he wasn't, to my understanding and to what I have read from the testimony, he had never actually pointed the weapon or raised the weapon towards the SWAT team yet. But he was shot down because of an accidental shooting. And then, again, the rest of the shots fired. So, under the guidelines of what SWAT teams or what these officers are trained to do, they're often cleared of wrongdoing. Which means all that had to happen is the threshold was changed. The threshold was moved from over here to where, unless you are actually in danger, you don't take out the target, to if you even if you suspect a little bit of danger, if there's a little bit of risk to you, you are now a target. You now are going to be taken out. And you could see this. You could go on the internet and you could view all kinds of situations where the police are very far away from the individual who is possibly holding a knife. And they're in Michigan. It happened in Michigan not too long ago. A mentally deranged individual who had mental problems was in a parking lot. He had a little knife. They kept telling him to drop it. He started walking away, and literally they opened fire on him and they murdered him. This is the new standard. This isn't the standard being used in other parts of the world. It is a standard being used now. So, what can we do about this? What can I do? I do what I can do. I run for office. make videos like this. I post videos like this. I talk to city councilmen. I try to encourage the public to do something. And it's not for me. I only have so many years left. It's for my kids. It's for my grandkids. It's for your grandkids. That's why I do this. And what can we do? Well, we can do a lot. We're like, well, what can we do about it? I can't do anything about it. You know, who am I? You could do a lot, because at the localist level, all politics is local. On the local level, you can do a lot. You can hook up with people like me. You can network with people like me. I'm not the only one. You can join groups like PANDA, which are people against the NDAA. You can join. You can run for a local office, whether it be a township trustee, or whether it be a city council member, or whether it be for your local school board. And you can bring these things out into the open and talk about these issues with other people. This is extremely important. And then you could do other things. If you see Hummers running around the streets doing things that are outside of the order, you could complain about it. You can complain about it to the coordinators for the street, you can, or to coordinators for the program, the 1033 program at the state. You can complain about it to your local city council. You could say you don't want these things going on. What you can do is you can use today's technology. You can use these more than anything else, because thanks to these, we're exposing all kinds of aggressive and excessive policing that are going on. If it wasn't for these, you imagine how many people would be sitting in prison because the police officers will lie and cover for each other if they've done something wrong, and if you're going to take the fall for it. So cameras on the telephone, on our cell phones, are a very important thing to do. Record, post, share. This is what you can do more than anything else. So in closing, I want to make sure that you understand what you can do, because I want to take back the freedoms that are gone. I see what I've lost. I've been exposed to this. And I hope I've been effective in informing you about the history of the history of the police, and a short, brief history of SWAT, and also comparing the role to the role of soldiers. We have to take a look at this line. There's a crossing over point, and we're accepting this because we are kept in fear. It's an acronym that's used by the military, even used by commercial alarm companies, for example. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. If you're uncertain about something and you doubt that you can keep yourself safe, it is a fantastic method. It's a fantastic rationality to use to get you to relinquish your rights or to buy an object. Imagine if somebody was selling you an alarm and you lived in a rough neighborhood, and they were telling you, look, there's all kinds of houses around your neighborhood that are broken into. You're probably next. Well, if you're actually next, you got to do something. You got to get an alarm. I mean, it's just an excellent reason for you to buy one. You know, the boogeyman is coming. ISIS, Ebola, everything. It's all coming down the pike. You know, beware, fear. The government can keep you safe. Government can't keep you safe. That's the problem. The government can keep you confined. The government can keep you down, but the government can't keep you safe. So, the Posse Comitatus Act was passed in 1878 to ensure that the military was outside the scope of policing the streets. But today, with our ideological war on poverty, terror, and drugs, and with the military Humvees seen parked in City Hall parking lots across the nation, we are becoming very complacent to this. We are becoming good with this. This is the norm. You know, we see, my age group sees life through our experiences, so I see the change. But a little boy or a little girl who's holding their mother or father's hand, walking into a city hall, walking past a Humvee that's still in battle gear, battle dress, sitting in front of City Hall, that's their norm. That's going to be their perspective. That's their history through their life. It always was. This always was. That's all. It's never changed. We don't know any other way. This is the only way we know. So I'm definitely concerned with your grandkids. It's my hope that you're concerned with yours as well. And thanks for taking the time to listen. Have a great day.